Hello everyone, and welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This week's set of videos are going to be on philosophy of religion. So without further ado, let's hop on into the lecture. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. All right. Hopefully it will bring it up here soon. Oh, is it gonna do it? All right, let's go big screen. All right. Okay, so what exactly are we doing when we do philosophy of religion? So philosophy of religion is, it's a subdiscipline in philosophy. And so basically it's asking questions about um, God's existence, God's attributes, and God's relationship with human beings. So there's a couple of problems within these different questions. So philosophers of religion ask questions about the problem of evil. So they ask, does the existence of evil count against the existence of God, or does the existence of evil make God's existence less probable? And then you have cosmological arguments, teleological arguments. So these are arguments to the effect of there's a world and a universe, at least for the teleological argument. The argument goes that there's a world that exhibits some kind of design or purposiveness. So there's these it's a set of constants within the universe, and they're so finely tuned that it's pretty improbable for all of those constants to have come together by accident. So the best explanation is that there has to be someone who designed the universe, basically. So it's an existence not so much to a particular god, but to just the god of theism, which we'll get to in a minute, or the god of traditional theism. Then you also have cosmological arguments. So it seems like for something, you have a bunch of creatures that like we could have not been here. So then that seems to leave us with this question of, well, why are we here? What explains us being here rather than not being here? Because it seems more likely that, well, I didn't cause my own existence, so it seems more probable that I didn't exist or shouldn't have existed. So cosmological arguments argue that, hey, you've got a lot of things that are like dependent on something else for their existence. There's got to be ultimately this one thing that everything is ultimately dependent on for it to exist. So then what philosophers of religion also talk about God's attributes. So they ask about, well, what is God like? So let's see. Typically, so in the history of philosophy of religion, there is a tradition that claims that God is like the greatest possible being that there ever is. So if you take any attribute that we human beings have and you think about having it in the greatest and the best possible way, God has it in that way. So there's a lot of arguments, going back and forth, trying to make sense of, well, what does it mean for God to be all powerful actually? Does it mean that God has the ability to make a rock so heavy that he can't lift it? Or does God's omnipotence or having all power mean that he does everything that it's logically possible to do? So it's questions, trying to make sense of the attributes and also trying to make sense of, well, how do all of the attributes fit together? Does it make sense that a being who, let's see, what would be a good, well, you'll see it in the problem of evil lecture, in the other lecture, but does it make sense to have a God who claims to be omnipotent, who is all powerful, and who knows everything, and yet is also supposed to be all good and allows evil? So there's this tension between these attributes. It seems like if God is all loving and he's got all the power and all the knowledge. He knows where the evil is. He has the ability to stop the evil. And it seems like if he's all good, he wants to. So then why hasn't he stopped evil? So it's trying to make sense of God's attributes. And there's other attributes that this crops up for, but the area where I see it coming through the strongest is in the problem of evil. And then philosophers of religion also ask about, well, how does God interact with humans? What's God like? Can he have a relationship with us? Does he have a relationship with us? Or is he more like a deistic God? Did he just kind of get things going, but then he's kind of like hanging out somewhere doing his own thing? So this is just a really quick survey of the kinds of things that philosophers of religion talk about. Now, it's not up here on the slides, but philosophers of religion also talk about problems within their own tradition. So for Christian philosophers of religion, they might ask about questions about the Trinity. There's a doctrine that says that God is transcendent. And what that means is that he's separate from his creation. And so he's just somehow very, very, very different from the creatures that he's made. But Christians believe that God became a man. So Christian philosophers of religion will take time to think through, okay, well, how are those two attributes compatible? God is something that's not human. He's very other than human. So how did he actually become a human? So it's basically philosophy of religion is thinking, using the tools of philosophy to ask questions about the existence of God. Now, it might be kind of confusing to think about these attributes in the sense that, like, which God are we talking about? Because it seems like depending on the tradition that you're coming from, you might end up with different attributes. Some traditions might take some attributes to be more important than others. So then you kind of think, well, how in the world do philosophers have the conversation about these same things? Well, you'll notice that there is, within philosophy of religion, typically, when they start talking about God, they're talking about the God of traditional theism. So it's the idea that God is the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving creator of the world. So when I'm talking about God in the upcoming lectures this week, this is the idea of God that I have in mind. So it's not the Christian God or the Jewish God or the Muslim God or any other God from any other tradition. It's this pretty generic understanding of what broadly theism takes God to be like. Okay, so this week we're talking about the Socratic dialogue, the Euthyphro. And so the question that arises for us in this dialogue is, what is piety? So the dialogue starts off with Euthyphro taking his father to court for the murder of a murderer. So basically what happened was a slave murdered someone on the job. And this was a slave of Euthyphro and his dad. So what happened was the dad caught the slave that was murdered and put him in a pit and basically let him die while they went to ask this authority what they should do about this slave. And so what happens is Euthyphro's like, yeah, I'm going to take my dad to court. He basically murdered this guy, and this seems to me to be the right thing to do. And so then Socrates gets to wondering, first he kind of expresses shock that Euthyphro would take his own dad to court. And then he starts asking Euthyphro, well, what exactly is piety? What is being pious? Or another way to say what pious is, or like, is what's the good thing to do? So, or the right thing to do. So then Euthyphro and Socrates, just like in all the other dialogues, they're going to start asking, well, what is it to be pious? What is it to have piety? Okay, so then the first suggestion as to what piety is persecuting the wrongdoer. So Euthyphro basically tells Socrates, hey, look, piety is taking those who've done wrong and bringing them to justice. But Socrates points out, rightly, I think, that that just tells us what piety looks like. It's an example of a pious action. And that's not going to help us figure out what piety actually is. So it would kind of be like if somebody asked you, or you ask someone, it's a good example here. So imagine that you are asking somebody, you want help with a math equation, and you don't want to just understand the problem that you're looking at, but you want someone to help you understand the formula. But then imagine that the person that you ask basically just takes a different problem and shows you how to work it using that formula. Well, they showed you how the formula works, they showed you an application of the formula, but they didn't help you understand what the formula is. Is this the formula for a line? Is this the formula for a circle? So in a sense, they've just given you an example of what the formula is supposed to be for, but they haven't explained to you what the formula is. And you're interested in, hey, what's the formula? So in other words, when someone explains to you what a formula is in that manner, they've not told you what you were looking for. They're not helping you to understand what the formula is. Because think about it. If you understand the formula, you can apply it to so many other things. And that's what Socrates is interested in here. He's not interested in, I don't want a list of, all the pious actions you could give. I want you to tell me what piety is so that I can actually know how it shows up in other areas of my life. Right? So when we're thinking about, what the good thing to do is, we kind of want something a little stronger than just examples, right? Because we might run into something that we've never seen an example of before. And we're kind of like, oh, we haven't come across that example and we don't know what to do. And because we've not been told what the good is, we're at a loss. So that's the desire that Socrates has. He wants to know, hey, like, what is piety really? Because I want to know how to be pious in all the other ways in my life. All right, so then Socrates points out, giving examples isn't going to work because it doesn't help me understand what piety actually is. So then Euthyphro suggests, hey, maybe it's just what the gods love. And Socrates points out, well, you'll notice from the stories of the gods that the gods seem to love different things. And Euthyphro agrees to this. So Socrates sets him up to show, hey, well, it looks like the same action is loved by some of the gods and isn't loved by some of the other gods. So one of the examples he uses is Zeus and one of the other gods. Zeus thinks that taking your father to court or bringing him to justice on your own, that's the right thing to do, but another god disagrees with him. So then the problem there seems to be, okay, well, one god thinks that it's good, it's pious, the other god thinks that it's not pious, so they can't agree. So how can the pious be what's loved by the gods if not all of the gods agree that that action is pious? So it leaves you kind of at a loss, because if it's loved by the gods, well, seems like all the gods need to love it in order for it to actually be pious. So then Euthyphro and Socrates get to wondering, does it have its own nature? So here's how this problem goes. Here's what Socrates says. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is the pious because it is loved by the gods? All right, that was a mouthful. So let's put it in a little bit different terminology to see if we can understand the question. So Socrates is asking Euthyphro, is something good just because God says so, or is something good because good has its own nature? So another way to put the question is, does good have its own nature, or does God just tell us what's good? So this is the worry here. And a little bit later in the lecture, we'll get to why this is an important problem. So Socrates thinks that the pious can't just be what the gods love. So Socrates shows that there's a difference between being loved and being lovable. So if something is God loved, then that just tells me that the gods love it, right? So if you love, I don't know, chocolate cake, then that just tells me that you love it. But if something's lovable, then there's something about that thing that makes it such that the gods love it. So there's something about the thing itself uh, that makes it be worth loving. So think about it this way. Remember the Ted Bundy example from last week when we talked about well-being? So Ted Bundy loved in the sense of desired, wanted to do, he was aiming towards um, this kind of life. He loved murdering and mutilating people. So when we say that Ted Bundy loved murdering and mutilating people, that just tells us that he loves it. But if something is lovable, then that means there's something about that thing that makes it worth doing, worth admiring. And we would say that what Ted Bundy did objectively is not something lovable. So there's a sense in which, yes, Ted Bundy loved it. So his behavior of murdering and mutilating people, it was loved, but we can question if that thing is lovable because there's a standard against which we measure the worth of killing and murdering people. And we think that that's wrong. So let's kind of move back into what Socrates is saying and see if we can get even a better handle on the difference here. So if the pious and the God-loved are really the same, then all we learn about piety is that it's whatever the gods happen to love. And that just turns into an arbitrary mess. So what Socrates is trying to point out to Euthyphro is that, look, if the pious and the God-loved, if they're really the exact same thing, then all that we learn about piety is that it's whatever the gods happen to have a whim to want to be the case. And so then we have worries about, well, what if, one day Zeus, tries to, he thinks that taking your father to court is okay. And then the next day he thinks, nah, that's not cool. I don't like that anymore. Think about how hard that God would be to try to please. And you'll notice in this dialogue that one of the concerns that Euthyphro has and Socrates is trying to make sense of, well, what is piety? And one understanding of that Euthyphro wrestles with is, well, you try to please the gods when you're pious. But if what pleases someone always shifts, they can't ever be pleased. So that might be a worry there as well. So we have worries about how do we know what's good? That worry is still there. So for Socrates, the pious has its own nature, apart from whether the gods love it or not. But Socrates and Euthyphro never figure out what that nature, in fact, is. So all that Socrates has done here is just to show that given what Euthyphro has said, something being loved by the gods and something being pious cannot be the same thing. And you'll see in the dialogue that Euthyphro just collapses back into saying that the pious is just what the gods love. All right, so then we might ask, so what? What's the significance of the Euthyphro dilemma? Socrates and Euthyphro, they don't even answer the question about piety. It ends just like all the other Socratic dialogues. So what are we supposed to learn here? So this dilemma is actually something that a lot of ink has been spilt over in philosophy of religion. And it's a problem for theism, but it's also a problem for ethics. And so we'll kind of take a look at why we should be worried about this problem. if what's good is just what the gods say, and we'll look at this is the theism version of the problem. So if the good is just what the gods say, then the good could change at any moment. So the worry is, what if murder suddenly became the good thing to do? So let's trek on back to our Ted Bundy example. All right, so we think that what Ted Bundy did was wrong. We think that, murdering and mutilating people, it's not just not a good way to live our lives, it's wrong. But if what's good is what the gods say, what if suddenly God decided to change his mind and say that that was a good way to live your life? First of all, I think we kind of have this intuition that, like, oh, I don't know if that could actually be the thing. And that's kind of an intuition toward maybe the good has its own nature. But then you also might wonder, well, then how do we ever know if we're living a good life? If the good is just what someone declares it to be, then, like, is it worth even trying to live a good life? The standards could change, and they might always be changing. So then we might wonder, well, what's the value of the good at all? So then there's a worry about the other side of that dilemma. Well, what if good has its own nature? What this means for the theist is that there's something that stands outside of God's nature to which God has to adhere. So remember earlier in the lecture when I mentioned that philosophers, there's a conception of God as like the greatest possible being. And so, as the greatest possible being, there's like nothing outside of God to which he has to obey, which he has to worship, or which he has to submit himself to. So that means there's nothing higher than he is. So this worry about the good having its own nature is it seems like there's something outside of God's nature to which, God has to like obey the rules. So think about like when your parents gave you a standard of um, basically just how to behave in their home, right? So they gave you a list of rules, and because you were under their authority, you had to obey the rules. So anytime you have to adhere to some standard, whether that be in a classroom or like living in someone else's home, that means that there's something above you to which you are subject. And so if there's a standard of good that isn't God, there's something that's greater than God, and then God ends up not being the greatest possible being. So there's a tension there between what you kind of learn in philosophy of religion or from traditional theism should be true of God versus, oh yeah, we kind of want the good to have its own nature. So if the good has its own nature, we've got this problem with thinking that God is the greatest possible being. All right. So then here is the more ethical version of the Euthyphro Dilemma. So if the good is just what we stipulate, so maybe we as a society or just the community in which you live, then the good seems arbitrary and you just don't know what's truly good. So thinking about that Ted Bundy case, not only would we not know if it's morally wrong for Ted Bundy to actually live his life the way that he did, but we would know, like, what constitutes a good life. So what you might want to notice here is that Socrates' discussion of the disagreeing gods is a semi-argument against relativism. So we talked earlier in the semester about relativism. And so the worry here is not quite that there isn't any good at all, but the worry is, how do you know? Because if there's a standard according to which I want to live my life, I want to ask who says, right? I want to make sure that the authority that I'm supposed to be adhering to is the right kind of authority. But if you're just stipulating what's good and what's not, and if the authorities can change, you have this shifting sand of how you live your life, what's morally good and what's morally bad. And so that seems to be a problem. We want, well, I would think that, we would kind of want something that we build our life around to be stable. We wouldn't want it to shift all of the time. So if the good is something that's stipulated by people, you do have this worry about that standard of how you live your life, of what constitutes a good life could shift. So then the other problem is that if good has a nature, then we need to figure out what the good is in order to be good. So it's something that we're striving towards, that we've got to figure out. And that seems like it can be a Herculean task, right? That seems like it's very hard to do, because it's, where do we start to look for that? If you want to take it from a more philosophy of religion angle, do you start looking for the nature of goodness in Revelation? Do you start looking for the nature of goodness in nature? How can you start to figure out what's good and what's not? So it seems like we've got some pretty big problems that the Euthyphro Dilemma raises. Oops, I went the wrong direction. All right, so this is my question for you, and this will show up in your journal for this week. So what do you think? Is the good something that we decide, or God decides in the case of theism, or is the good something that has its own nature, regardless of what we think about it? So before I say anything else, I wanted to say that this question it's one of the oldest in philosophy. It comes from a Socratic dialogue, so of course it's been out there for a while. But it's also one of the hardest. So kudos to you for sticking with the reading and working through the dialogue. But also, this seems like it's a super huge question, right? So is the good something, that we decide, or God decides? Or is the good something that has its own nature, regardless of what you or I think about it? Because seems like you're going to have problems either way. So you have the problem of arbitrariness, and then that leaves us with the I don't know worry. If what's good is what other people say, how do we keep it from, how do we know that, how do we know that it's actually like the good thing to do? How do we keep the good or the right from being arbitrary? But if good has its own nature, then there's two questions here. How do we figure out what that good thing is? And then for the theist, how do you make sense of, well, if God's supposed to be good and good has its own nature, then it looks like God's subject to something outside of him, and he's not the greatest possible being. So there's a lot of big questions here. So what I'm asking you to do in your journal is just kind of sort through the question the best that you can. Remember that there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. In terms of sifting through this question, all that I'm looking for you to do is just to wrestle through, what's the best position? What has the best reasons behind it? And what has the most force of argument? So just to tip my hand, so that you kind of can see that maybe it's not quite a dilemma. What I think you can do, so I am a theistic philosopher of religion, and I think that there's actually a way to get around this bottom worry for the theistic philosopher of religion. So you can do something like say, well, yes, good has its own nature, but it's connected to the nature of God in such a way that goodness, as we know it, as we understand it and we recognize it, flows from the nature of God, but it's not something that's outside of God. It's from God, but it's not something arbitrary. It's not something that he decides. So God's nature gives what's good a kind of grounding, so it's not going to change, because part of God's nature, according to most philosophers of religion, is that he can't change. So if you ground goodness in God's nature and God's nature doesn't change, goodness doesn't change. And you get around these worries of God being beholden to some standard outside of himself, because the standard comes from within him, but it's not something that he can change. So that's kind of a rough and ready answer that someone could give to this problem. It does, that solution does have some worries in it, right? So it makes it sound like there's a sense in which God is not free because, hey, he's got this nature that limits him, but that's a question for another day. So I just want you to see that there are some ways to answer this question. It takes sometimes a little bit of just really thinking through God's attributes and then seeing how we can square it with some of our intuitions about what we think is right or what is good. And so don't get discouraged if this question feels big or scary. It's a very hard question, but I think it's worth thinking about. And if it helps, you could think about this question in terms of what's the best way to ground goodness, or to think about where the good comes from. You could think about this question, think about it like, where do you want, or where are your intuitions at about what makes something good or bad? So hopefully that'll help you as you think about answering this question, to see what options are available to you in order to answer it. Because the importance of this question, remember, does come down to, how do we know that we're living a good life? How do we know that we're doing what's right? And that seems like an important question. So this question about where the good comes from, that's also a really important question. So hopefully this will be helpful as you think through this question for yourself. All right, so that is the end of this lecture on the Euthyphro Dilemma, and I will see you soon for another lecture.